Hello and welcome to The Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. For the first time on the show, I'm welcoming back an author I interviewed last year, and I could not be more excited about it. Christy Lefteri is one of my favourite authors, bringing us novels based around important social and global issues such as the war in Syria, the refugee crisis, domestic workers in Cyprus, and now with her new novel, Climate Change and Corporate Greed. At the heart of her novels lie intimate family dynamics, love, hope, loss, and healing, as she helps us grapple with some of the world's biggest issues and crises. In The Book of Fire, Christy's latest novel, she transports us to Greece, to an ancient village that has experienced a devastating fire. She takes us into the lives of a small family dealing with their own loss and suffering, as well as the destruction of their home and their environment. She poses big questions around what would happen if we carry on harming the world as we are, and what we can do to collectively heal. I'm so glad she's my guest today. Brought up in London, Christy Lefteri is the child of Cypriot refugees. Her novel, The Beekeeper of Aleppo, is an international bestseller, selling well over 1 million copies worldwide and is published in over 40 countries. It won the Aspen Literary Prize and was runner-up for the Dayton Literary Prize. It's currently being performed as a play for the Nottingham Playhouse and touring the UK. Songbirds is her follow-up novel and was a Sunday Times and international bestseller. The Book of Fire will be published on August the 17th. Hi Christy, welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf. Actually, welcome back to the show. I'm so glad to have you back on the show. How are you doing?
I'm fantastic, and thank you so much for inviting me to come back. And it's amazing because we were just saying that I was your first guest on your podcast, and now here we are.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the podcast obviously now is kind of a year old, so we're a year on. And so it feels like a really sort of wholesome, full circle moment, but also I think so interesting because when we spoke last time, The Book of Fire, which is your new book coming out in August, I think at that point you said like, oh, I have this idea and I've kind of like, I've put it to my agent, but I haven't really started working on it. You just had a baby that was a few months old. And now, a year on, this book is ready to come out into the world.
To put it like that, I realise how much work I've done in a year. I didn't realise. You don't realise sometimes. You just sort of live life and plod along and not realise where you started. But actually, when we spoke, it was just the seed of an idea. And then, you know, I'd already started a little bit of research by that point, actually. But I wasn't sure how I was going to bring it together and what I was going to do. Yeah. So to look back and realise that, actually, thank you for bringing that up because it makes me feel proud of myself.
So The Book of Fire is, if I'm not wrong, is your fourth book. And this has come after Songbirds, which came after The Beekeeper of Aleppo, which obviously was this like huge multi-international bestseller award winner, like absolutely heartbreaking, stunning book. And obviously Songbirds was also an international bestseller. When you came to write this one, The Book of Fire, and I understand that also your personal life had changed so much as well because you were a new mother when you were writing it. What was the writing like for you personally? Did you feel like a different person coming to writing this time around?
Such an interesting question. There's a lot of things that's made me think about. If I compare it first to Songbirds, because there's something very specific happened when I was writing Songbirds, and that's that we were in lockdown. And I feel that writing during lockdown, without the freedom of being able to research freely, I do a lot of sort of kind of, in inverted commas, field research, you know, when I'm writing. And I need to feel free to be able to do that. And when I was writing Songbirds, I didn't have that freedom. It was taken from all of us, you know. And so it affected all of our work in so many different ways. And so if I compare writing The Book of Fire, where I could say, right, there's something missing here in my research. I need to go and speak to this person, or I need to go to this place or visit that place. And I had the freedom to do that. When I was writing Songbirds, I didn't have the freedom to do that. And I feel like that came through somehow in the writing, interestingly, in the way that I wrote about entrapment a lot. So when I wrote the Book of Fire, I had that freedom. However, I was restricted in another way, but in a lovely way, in that I was a mother. And I had to think about Evie and Evie's needs first, and spending time with her and looking after her and balancing career with motherhood. And also the subject matter of the book, which is about what we're doing to this world, really, and thinking quite deeply about the world that Eve is growing up in. That passion, seeing her so innocent, so helpless as a tiny little baby, seeing her little developments fed into my desire to write the story. And she also, I don't know if you noticed this, but she kind of appears in the story, because there were times where I was like breastfeeding her or holding her, and I'd sort of absorb those moments and take them in. And then when she was asleep, I'd write down something, like just the way she looked up at the clouds, or the way her eyes looked, or the way she sort of took in her environment. And this I used within the story when Irini is remembering Hara as a baby. So I used motherhood in so many different ways. One was, what world is our children going to grow up in? And the other one was just the simple day-to-day living with a baby, and the time, I mean, exhaustion with exclamation marks, but also those beautiful moments where you just see them like look up and suddenly connect with the world. Things like that I wrote down. So yes, I was an entirely different person to Beekeeper. If I compare it to writing Beekeeper, I wrote Beekeeper in a state of utter sadness. I really, really did. I almost remember that time and fear it. So maybe that's what came through in Beekeeper, but I can't keep writing like that. Otherwise I would die.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I think, of course, I was going to write like that for Beekeeper, because my parents were refugees, because I'd been there and seen the children and seen people and took it on board and took it inside me. I carried it, like I couldn't forget about it. And so it came through. With Songbirds, it was different. Like I said, I had less of that personal connection. I still did the research before we went into lockdown, but it wasn't an ongoing thing. I had to do a lot of things on Zoom, which is fine and it worked, but it's not the same as, especially when you're writing about trauma and things like that, to look at someone right in the eyes without the screen in between you, to go somewhere and feel something, smell it, see it, hear it. It's a lot different. But when I come to the Book of Fire, I feel I was weirdly very, very, almost like we'd come out of this cage that we'd been in during lockdown, and I was very open to being, to feeling, to connecting, at the same time being exhausted and having that experience of motherhood feed into what I was writing. So with each book, I was not entirely different person, but in an entirely different place in my mind.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Like, oh, it was so beautiful, everything that you said, especially with in relation to sort of how your experiences of motherhood and watching Evie as this helpless baby sort of grow up or begin to grow up in a world that is ever changing, but also one that we are hurting constantly. And Beekeeper, I mean, the book is incredibly sad, so I'm not surprised at all that that process for you was so sad and that you were so deep in those sad emotions at the time as well, because the story is so devastating. And Songbirds, I think, is sad, but I felt like Songbirds gave me more questions and it made me think a little bit more than Beekeeper. I was able to sort of absorb the story. You're almost like watching it unfold. Whereas Songbirds, I think, because it felt like a bit of a mystery, because we don't know what had happened, you're somewhat a bit more a bit more active, or you're thinking a bit more about the story rather than like just consuming it.
Yeah, I totally get that.
Yeah, and this one and the Book of Fire, I kind of feel like is a mixture of both in some ways, and does feel very different. But as you rightly said, like it is about what we are doing to the world. And I mean, you know, when we know what it's about, and even from the first few pages, it is a reminder of what is happening to the environment, what is happening for the future, the world that we're going to grow up in, the world that the future generation is going to grow up in. But I wondered if you could just take a short moment just to briefly introduce your book.
So the Book of Fire is set in an ancient forest in Greece. It's an unnamed place in Greece, which has the people in the story. This village where the story's set has just experienced a devastating fire that's burnt almost the entirety of this ancient forest. The protagonist, Irini, lives with Tasso, her husband, and Hara, her daughter, and they continue to live within this burnt ancient forest, the forest that no longer exists. And at the beginning of the story, Irini goes out for a walk with her dog, and now that the forest is burnt, she sticks to the same path. But on this particular day, the dog runs off, and she has to follow her, and she reaches an old chestnut tree, an ancient chestnut tree, which is half burnt and half alive. And beneath this tree is the man who started the fire. And something terrible has happened to him. I don't want to say too much. I'm going to say he's close to death. And it's unclear how he's found himself in this situation. Has someone tried to murder him, or has he committed suicide? And this is the man who started the fire. And that discovery leads Irini to make a decision that then haunts her. And at the same time, we are introduced to her family, the traumas that they've suffered from losing people that they love. Tasso has lost his father, to losing their environment. And it's that family bond and how these characters learn to sort of be together again and love each other again in a way that people after a trauma have to relearn in a similar way to how somebody might have to relearn to walk if they can after an, they have to relearn to be together and relearn to find the joy and the happiness in the world when so much has been taken. And so yes, it's about this one man's grief, but there's a bigger ghost in a way hovering above this man's greed, which is the way that we are all contributing to this fire and how big it became and how devastating it became. And it's also on a smaller scale about this family and the love that they have for each other.
Yeah. And I think that, you said how it's about one man's greed, and that is actually representative of sort of global capitalism and consumerism and corporate interests and corporate behavior.
Yeah.
And even throughout the book, like, we see that this isn't the first time that something like this has happened, and it seems to be like a tactic that people are using to further their own interests, which is really ugly and really confronting to read.
So just to be clear to the audience, so this man who Irini calls Mr. Monk, he burns a portion of the forest in order to build a small hotel. And this is something that often happens. And what he doesn't realize is that he's not going to be able to contain the fire. He thinks he can, but he can't. And the reason that the fire can't be contained, I won't go into, but there are other reasons that are not to do with him.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just wanted to sort of put that in so that people...
Yeah, absolutely. And so one of the sort of overarching ideas or themes of the book is guilt, and I think survivor's guilt. And so it's interesting because in the family, so we have Irini and her husband and her daughter. Now, Irini is the only one who is kind of unscarred or just doesn't have any injuries or anything. And so she's the one that's kind of having to hold the family together and hold everyone up. And her husband is injured and his hands are injured. And when you read the book, you'll understand why that's so significant. And also her daughter is hurt as well. But there's so much other kind of, I guess, survivor's guilt throughout the book, which is Irini's husband, who was unable to find his father. And then when Irini and her daughter were kind of moving away in the water, they met an old woman who passed away. And I just wondered, what did you really want to bring out about survivor's guilt? And how did you kind of channel whatever your thoughts and your feelings were into the story?
Well, that's interesting. Actually, you've asked me a question that I probably haven't thought about properly yet. However, it's made me think of something right now. So, survivor's guilt. I think I wrote about it without realizing. But so, how am I going to describe this? Because it's all off the top of my head now. Because sometimes when you're writing, it's a very unconscious process. You're tabbing into things that you don't realize. But you saying that and asking me that question has made me realize something. So after my dad was a commanding officer in the war in Cyprus in 1974, and I spoke about this a lot when I was interviewed for Beekeeper, when people were asking me how come you're so interested in war and how come you're so interested in refugees, and my parents were refugees. But the thing that affected me the most was my dad's PTSD, because I didn't experience the war. And after I wrote Beekeeper, he said to me, so we had a conversation because I'd written about transgenerational trauma for The Observer. And he said, I remember I was going for a walk, and he said, what are you doing? I said, I'm having a break. He said, what are you doing? And I told him I'm writing this article for The Observer. And he said, what's it about? And I told him transgenerational trauma. And he said, what's that? And as soon as I explained it to him, he said, well, and he just went into, for the first time in my life, his memories of the war. And a lot of them had to do with survivor's guilt. But if you ever read my article in The Observer, you can find it online on transgenerational trauma. It's a lot about what's not spoken is felt. And because I did a psychoanalytic training for many years. So what's not spoken is felt, or what's not spoken is acted out. And that's why it gets passed on to the next generation in this confused, chaotic way. Because the next generation doesn't know what's going on. They don't know that I don't know my dad has survivor's guilt, but I experience the actions of survivor's guilt without words, which is worse, because then it's like, what the hell is this kind of thing? So I lived in the shadow of that. So what I'm thinking now, this survivor's guilt that my dad had, because he was the commanding officer, and a lot of the things he told me was that he felt that there were people he should have rescued that he didn't rescue, and their deaths haunted him. And then there was this one man that stopped him in the streets of North London and said, do you know who I am? And my dad said, no. And he said, I am so-and-so, you saved my life.
Wow.
Right? Just stopped him in the streets of Palmer's Green in North London. And he remembered that, but that wasn't enough to take away the fact that he survived and other men didn't, and that he was the commanding officer and should have apparently made them survive, but they hadn't. And what lives would these men have had, and who would they have been, and blah blah blah. So I guess without realizing, because it wasn't spoken about, I live with that in my head. It's part of who I am. It's not me, but my dad in a way reacted to life in using that structure. He had this sort of internal structure, and that's how he reacted to life and people. And so I became part of that in a way. And so when you said to me survivor's guilt, I thought, oh, okay, I've done it again without realizing. So that's probably, I feel, talking to you now, and it's quite nice that it's all, our conversation is kind of spontaneous and it's all coming up, because saying it out loud makes me feel that's right. It feels right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it makes complete sense, because I also think that it's probably something that we didn't have a terminology for until fairly recently anyway.
Yeah.
There must have been people coming back from war and devastating crises for so long, experiencing this sense of survivor's guilt and not knowing what it is, but still understanding that it's this intense feeling of feeling guilty for having been alive when you have also witnessed. I think it is one thing like knowing that you're alive when so many other people aren't. And I think it's a different thing when you have experienced it and you have been within that and you have seen it.
Yes, exactly. And that can also trigger a lot of kindness. It doesn't only trigger PTSD, which it does often, but it can trigger kindness too.
Yeah.
And there's a family that helps Irini and her daughter and her husband later, who live in a different town and haven't been affected by the war. It's like what you're talking about. They haven't experienced it themselves, but they have this sort of survivor's guilt that triggers the kindness in them, and they want to help them.
Yeah. And so, you said that survivor's guilt is kind of some of the things that are not spoken about, especially in your experience. And in the book, there's quite a few times where, and it's usually Irini has told either her husband or her daughter, she said, I love you. And there's been like a blank, there's been no response. And I don't doubt for a moment reading the book that those characters don't love her. But for me, I think what kind of came up was how difficult it can be when you are dealing with something so traumatic to allow yourself to lean into something good or something lovely or joyful in your life. And I wanted to kind of know why you put, because that's a really small detail, because it didn't lead to the breakdown of the marriage, for example, but it's a very small detail. So I just wondered why you decided to drop that in a few times.
That's exactly for the reason that you explained, that it's difficult to lean in. I like the way you put it, that leaning in. Tasso, for example, he's lost completely in his own world. He will sit only underneath the one surviving tree, which is a fig tree in their garden. It's actually his dad's garden, because they're now living in his dad's house, which is one of the rare buildings that have escaped the fire, just because it was further east. But his dad didn't escape the fire. And so he's sitting beneath this fig tree all the time, and he's lost in his own world. And Irini wants him to react in any way. And she wants him to lean into her. I like the way you put it. It's that leaning in. And sometimes that's all she wants. She doesn't want that much more than that. So there's certain things that she does, little things that she says. I'm not going to ruin what happens in the story later, but particularly at the beginning and a lot of the story, he cannot lean in. Hara, on the other hand, she's more open. And I think there's a little jackal that appears in the story who's hurt, and it shows the capacity and the this is what I wanted with Hara and the jackal, that children, they feel a lot, they take in a lot, but they also have sometimes, because I was teaching for 20 years, and I saw sometimes strength that I thought, it's such an innocent strength in a way that sometimes we lose it as adults. And Hara has this strength that comes from a very pure desire to help this jackal. This is what I need to do. I am going to do it. And I've seen that reaction in children before. There's terrible things going on, but I need to do this, so I'm going to do it. And Hara has that. And it's her way of leaning in. So she's not as lost as her dad. And she's trying to pull her dad out of where he is, and he cannot be pulled out.
Yeah, because there is real frustration from her, because there's this bit where she keeps inviting him to, I think, play with her, and he keeps on saying, I'll play with you tomorrow, I'll play with you tomorrow. And she just gets to this point where she's like, tomorrow's just never going to come. And she keeps, and she knows, and it's that pure frustration. And also with Irini as well, that she's like, almost like she wants to shake her husband and bring him back to her. There's this constant sense throughout the book that there's loss even when the person is still in front of you.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
And I think especially like with their relationship, like that's the biggest one, because she feels like the man in front of her is not her husband, because he's not engaging, he's not speaking, he's not doing all the things that he used to love to do. And that's so difficult, because she's not able to label it as a form of grief or a form of loss, because there are people around her who have lost their partners and lost their loved ones. And again, I feel like that's also a form of guilt, I guess, as well.
Yeah, like Mrs. Gadagi. Mrs. Gadagi is a woman who visits the cafe. There's a cafe that's like a hub for the survivors. And Mrs. Gadagi has lost her husband, and it said to her numerous times, "I miss my husband," but she can't say that to Mrs. Gadagi, who's actually lost her husband.
Yeah.
She feels alone with this grief that she can't even name.
So the book is kind of like a story, or like a novel within a novel almost. So
Yeah.
Irini, she writes a book throughout the novel, and that's your structure. And it's, I guess, other ways people do it is like flashbacks and stuff, but you actually give us like a fully fledged story. She's writing it. I thought it was so clever because the chapters are also in her perspective, and then the book is in her perspective, but it sounds distinctively different. How did you do it?
So I thought, when we're telling a story of something that we've really been hurt by, it's so difficult to use I. Say, I did this and I was there. It's so difficult. And again, I suppose this goes back to everything we've been talking about, the silence, transgenerational trauma, what it means. Why do people not speak of their traumas? It's shattering. It's so difficult. So Irini realizes, after she finds Mr. Monk in the forest, that she wants to tell her story, but she cannot even accept that it started now. She wants to say it started a long, long time ago. She wants to say this happened a long time ago. This is a fairy tale. This isn't real. This happened to a mother and a child and a father. This happened to someone else. And by distancing herself a little bit, she can then tell the story. And then by telling the story, she can bring it back to herself. I won't say too much about that. That's closer to the end. But I guess where that comes from is me. So where I feel something, if I say I lost, my biggest trauma is I lost my mum. I was quite young. I lost my mum. If I'm going to talk about it so clearly, it sort of breaks me again. It shatters time. Whereas if I can just take a little bit of a step back and write a story about a girl who loses her mum, I can sit down in my mind. That's how I imagine it. I'm sitting down in my mind and I'm saying, feel it. Allow yourself to feel it. And I can allow myself. And I think that's the beauty of writing and art. We can say, we don't have to let ourselves break. Let me sit down in my mind. Let me rest. Let me feel it. I'm going to write this story. The characters are going to have different names. And you sort of play. It's like you're playing then. And you're kind of tricking yourself a little bit. But it's fine, because that's what all play is. All play is a sort of trick of reality, isn't it? We sort of, when I studied psychoanalysis, play is a way of children symbolize, it's a symbolic play. It's like they take things from life without even realizing they sort of symbolize. They don't even realize they're doing it. It's all sort of there in their play. Writing and art and things that we create, whatever it is, we're sort of symbolizing something, and there's a safety in it. So yeah, that's where that came from. It came from directly. That's something that came directly from me.
Yeah, and I thought it was great, because you can really tell that she's crafting this story, because there's like very simple descriptions that are not in the voice of Christy Lefteri, right? These are very simple descriptions of people and places and things, because she's just stripping it bare as to what happened and how this made her feel and who said what and how they said it. But also there's like an element of mystery, things that she doesn't want to disclose. But one thing it got me thinking about, because this is also something that you write about, is how when we're writing a story, we're in control of its ending. And we're in control of the whole thing, really, but we're in control of its ending. And especially if you're in the throes of something difficult. So you say at one point in the book that the reason why we like to read stories where people are going through tribulation but it ends in hope is because it gives us kind of like gives us hope that we too will get out of the situation that we're in.
Mm.
I'm paraphrasing is a different, you say it much
Yeah.
more eloquently,
Yeah.
but that's basically what you said. And that really struck a chord with me, because recently I drew the same conclusion. So I read a book that was about women struggling with fertility and not being able to have children. Something very close to my heart, because I have my own personal struggles
Right.
in that department. The particular book that I was reading didn't end with a happy picture of a woman getting pregnant and having a child. And it left me feeling so uneasy, and I couldn't put my finger on why, because this was this woman's experience and she found meaning and happiness in other ways.
Yeah.
But for me, it didn't give me the hope that I will get through whatever I'm getting through, because it wasn't the outcome that I desired. And so when I read that in your book, it just gave me such a strong kind of, like, it just struck such a chord as to exactly why we look for stories with hope.
Yeah, and as an extra point to what you've just said, I would recommend the book The Uses of Enchantment by Bettelheim, I think. I can't remember his first name. The Uses of Enchantment. He talks about the structure of fairy tales. So, there's a lot of parents that are like, oh, I don't want my children reading fairy tales because they're violent, or they're this or they're that. But what children do, and what actually we do without realizing sometimes, is we take the symbols behind these things. So something violent or something difficult in a fairy tale, there's a lot of difficulties and a lot of darkness in fairy tales, symbolize the darkness, the difficulties that we go through in our lives, the way that things can be sort of divided in our minds between good and bad. So therefore we have princesses and witches, and there's all different ways to interpret fairy tales, but this is one. And then at the end it's resolved, and there's some sort of happy ending. Normally with fairy tales there's the happy ending, and it symbolizes this idea that we can overcome our demons, and that in a way that's what children hear in fairy tales. There is something here that's difficult, that's dark, and I'm going to overcome it in this way, or in my way. And if you have to read the book, it's absolutely fascinating. But I really believe that's what stories can help us to do.
Absolutely, yeah.
Sort of find our way through the darkness and the messiness of life, and find whatever it is that gives us hope at the end.
Yeah, and I think especially when speaking about our trauma, or like even with the characters in your book, when speaking about it is so hard, I guess reading about it or writing about it is a form of healing.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And I feel that when I'm writing, and I've taught creative writing a lot as well, and I've seen students feel that way too.
And also another thing that's, I guess, healing for many people is art and painting, which is another thing running through the book. And we see that actually with Hara, because she picks up drawing later on in the book, and it does feel like it's at a point where she is coming out of her shell a little bit more, and she seems to be recovering from the ordeal that she's been through. But also there's so much loss as well, because the paintings that were done before symbolize what's been lost, or are a constant reminder of the forests and the land that has burnt in the fire. Yeah, I just wondered where the link with painting came, and also like how you managed to get it so vivid as well.
Well, I guess it's similar with Beekeeper, because Afra was an artist. So I had two loves growing up. One was writing and one was painting. And I suppose I got to the point where I was like, which one do I love more? Because you have to always decide. There has to be a decision, because you have to put a lot into the one that you love more. And so writing was my true love. But I loved painting, and painting for me was a way to express myself differently. And I remember when I still lived with my parents when I was younger, they had a shed at the back of the garden. Well, it was a garage that they didn't use as a garage. They used it more as a sort of storage shed. And I had oil paints in there because my mum wouldn't let me paint in the house because they stink, by the way, a lot, because there's turpentine and all that. And I just used to go and stand there in that garage shed and with the door open, and there was they had this like vine, I remember this grapevine running along the top of this sort of veranda where the shed was, and just sort of hear the wind in the vine leaves, and just it was so peaceful, and just paint. And when I painted, I wasn't worried what someone else going to think, because it wasn't going anywhere. And I just loved that feeling of the paints on my fingers. I painted a lot with my hands. It used to get all over me. I loved the smell, the feel, the putting the layers of the colours, because with oil paints they don't dry quickly like acrylic. It's all about that sort of layering of colours, and I loved it. And it has been years since I've painted. One of the reasons is I have like carpal tunnel in my wrists and things, and so I can't really. I mean, I'd have to, holding a paintbrush, just like holding a pen, is quite painful sometimes. So I don't really paint anymore. And I guess that love for painting, the colours, the textures, what I felt painting, it comes through sometimes. I create characters who paint because I can't paint anymore.
That's really beautiful. But I really felt, I think, reading the book especially, is to have a constant reminder visually in front of you of the home that you used to live in, the forest that you used to walk through. Like, that is tough. Like, that's really tough.
Yeah.
And so that, and obviously, like, it brought up loads of different emotions, and I think is part of the reason why, like, Irini's husband wouldn't come into the house very often. I think that's probably part of the reason it's not as stated. But I just wondered how you explored that, like almost like a juxtaposition of knowing everything that they've lost, but then living in a house that is full of paintings that have survived the fire of the place that used to be.
Yeah, so I'll give a little bit of background to that. So Dasso is a painter, or was a painter before the fire. And luckily, his dad took many of his paintings and hung them in his living room. And so there's the house that they now live in, luckily, has all these paintings that Dasso did hanging in the living room. And they are all paintings of the forest. And why he painted the forest in the first place, because he could see slight changes in the forest. And I won't go too far into this because I don't want to give too much away, but he lost his mum when he was quite young, and she died of cancer. And he loved her so much that he focused on the way she changed from day to day. He saw it in her. My mum died of cancer, and I remember waking up and just really noticing, is she worse? What has changed? Is there as much life in her today as there was yesterday? And really being aware constantly of that. Has her body changed? Has something shifted? Just almost being hypervigilant. And so Dasso experiences that at a really young age with his mother. And he starts painting as a sort of response to that. But he hears the stories his dad is telling him, because his dad works in the forest. And his dad is saying the forest is changing. So he starts sort of hypervigilantly noticing the changes in the forest. So before his mum dies, he paints her. And then there forever on, in a way, until the fire, he kind of obsessively paints the forest, almost trying to see these tiny changes that his dad could see. Is it becoming drier? Is the beauty still there? All these things that are sort of going on in his mind, the questions that he has, the things that he notices are coming out in his desire to paint the forest. So when the forest, in a way, dies, like his mother died, he can no longer paint it, and he kind of shuts down and withdraws.
Yeah, really fascinating. I loved it because it brought the place to life for someone that has never been, or like, it really, It really did. But it also made me feel so sad as well to know
Oh,
that.
yeah. And that's the answer to your question. I'm so sorry because I didn't answer your question. What those paintings are there, like I thought to myself, how sad to have a representation of something only. And what if in the end that's all we're left with? That was the thought that was coming to my mind. Like, what if we then only have representations, beautiful representations of things, representations that seem to move, that seem to smell and seem to kind of move in the breeze, but actually they don't. And they will never be the real thing. And the real trees, the 100-year-old trees, the 200-year-old trees, this ancient forest has gone. And yet there's this beautiful representation of it. So that's where I was going with that.
Yeah. And I think the same, like with the themes in Beekeeper as well. Like, what if the places that are ravaged by war never resurface in the way that they were before? What if, places stay rubble and the beauty that once was is completely lost? And I remember reading a book a while ago now, a good few years ago. I can't remember which one it was, but it was about somebody who had fled war, and they said that they couldn't be around anything that reminded them of where they came from. So they didn't want to eat the particular food or wear the clothing or speak the language, because the reminder of what was lost was just way too strong. And I just like that. It speaks volumes, and I guess it also shows this kind of trauma. And if you're not able to then speak about it and heal from it, that's when we get this transgenerational trauma which passes on.
Yeah. And just on from what you've said, like, imagine losing a person. You love them so much, and there's a wardrobe, and in that wardrobe is their jacket. And you just don't want to open that wardrobe, because if you that jacket, if you feel it, if you get their smell, you know you're going to break. It's like that. And I came across a word as I was doing my research, which is let me just pronounce it correctly, solastalgia, which means the grief and nostalgia we feel for the loss of our environment. And it's something we don't really think about or connect with, but actually we can have a very similar experience to losing our environment as we do a similar experience, not necessarily the same, just something similar about it, especially when there's a huge loss, like an entire forest, as we do when we lose a person that we love. And we cannot face that loss. And our environment is so much part of who we are, but we don't realize it. We kind of take it for granted.
For sure. And even in the way that we think about certain things, for example, like war, we tend to see war as being this like battle between men, for example, but we don't actually think about what's happening to the environment, what's happening to family structures, but also just in terms of actual environment, like with like Ukraine, for example, there's been acres and acres of forestry that's been damaged, and these are trees and things that have taken hundreds and thousands of years to grow, and we just don't think about it when we talk about war and those kind of traumas and suffering, which is really sad.
Yeah.
So you do have, obviously, at the core of your story is this family unit. And I love the different relationships that we see, mother and daughter, father and daughter. The mother and daughter relationship I found particularly interesting, because there's this sense that Hara is growing up, but she's not fully grown. She's not an independent adult yet. And so there's a lot she still turns to her mother for. But she also knows that her mother is not telling her the full truth. And she knows when, and she will call her out on it as well. And I feel like this is such a standard occurrence in girls and moms growing up together. But what did you really want to bring out about mother-daughter relationships, especially with this kind of balance that needs to be struck between a parent wanting to protect their child, but also have a relationship based on honesty and truth?
Yeah. I mean, I guess that was part of me imagining what my relationship might be like with Evie, and also remembering my relationship with my mum. And those things that are constantly playing out between a mother and a daughter. I want my freedom. Yes, yes, I need to give you your freedom because I want you to grow and flourish. But at the same time, I'm terrified. How do I? And I feel these tiny little things with Evie. It's going to sound silly, but how big is the bit of food that I'm going to give her to chew? Because what she does is I tell her to chew her food, swallows the food, and then chews.
Oh.
And that gives me a heart attack, like
Yeah.
literally, like I'm going to die from fear because I'm like, oh my God, you're going to choke, just chew the food kind of thing. And she's looking at me like, Mummy, I'm doing, obviously she doesn't say this, but she gives me this look like I'm doing what you're asking me to do. So then the decision is left with me. And this is such a silly decision, but it sort of answers your question, I think. How big do I cut the cucumber? How big do I make the slices of tomato? Because she's not chewing anything, right? So I want her to, because babies explore with their mouth, and I want her to have fun and explore, but at the same time I want her to be safe. And it's in the little things in life. And with Irini and her daughter, her daughter wants to go out and see for herself what's happened in the forest. She wants to see the things her dad won't allow himself to see. And the mother knows that there's something in her that's strong and that's creative and that's beautiful. And she wants her to go and be strong and face the world. But at the same time, she's terrified and she wants to hold on to her and lock her up inside, if you know what I mean. You know, not lock her up inside, but she wants to say, no, do not go into that forest. So it's that playing out of, there was a beautiful poem in the anthology when I used to teach GCSEs. I can't remember the name of the poem, but it's about this child. I can't remember even if it's a girl or a boy, but it's about a child, and the mum's holding like a rope or something and sort of pulling the child closer, but the child needs to go further. And then they get to this sort of windowsill or something. I can't remember that. And then she's either going to let the child fall or fly. There's this ending where I have to let go and will they fall or fly? It's that thing. It's a beautiful poem and I wish I could remember the title. Oh, I can't remember it. But if you're interested, just type in GCSE anthology poem about mother letting go of child.
Okay, I'll find it. I'll find it and I'll put it in the show notes. Don't worry.
Yeah, it's those things. I guess these things are on my mind now that I have a child.
Yeah, I loved it because it is, I guess, the small things that as the child gets older, it doesn't become any more about cucumber and tomato. It's like making bigger decisions about where they're going to go and how much freedom they're going to be allowed and those kind of things. And obviously, like, as like there's like even bigger questions that come up. So I really, I thought it was so great because also there is a very similar mother-daughter relationship in Songbirds.
Yeah, well,
again,
yeah, but it's more between her and the domestic worker. They're the real relationship. Yeah,
and that's when we have in Songbirds with the mother and daughter. It's that kind of like the communication isn't quite right. They're not speaking to each other openly, but they also, obviously, they are mother and daughter, and they're trying to do something together. So I really loved that. I thought it was very, very interesting.
Thank you. And there's something about mother and child relationships that are very messy, and they're messy than any other relationships. For example, when Evie's with her nanny, she responds differently. She's much more likely to get annoyed with me. So, for example, if she's with somebody else and they want to hold her hand and walk, she'll hold it. If with me and she's like, no, I'm an independent lady. She's 18 months, right? And she's like, get off my hand. Like, get off my hand, sort of thing. She doesn't say those words, but that's what she's communicating very strongly. She's very feisty to me. So then I have a decision. Well, obviously I'm not going to force her to hold my hand, and then I'm sort of walking around going, oh my God, she's going to fall over, she's going to step on this, she's going to blah blah blah, you know. And so there's that, the reaction of the child as well to the mother, who I think my mum used to say to me, well, why are you nicer to other people? And I was like, because I love you more.
Oh, that's true. My mum has said that to me a lot over the years as well. Why can't you be as nice to me as you are to everyone else?
Well, because we love them more. Because we are our full ourselves. No, I mean, obviously we can't just react however, but there's going to be messier reactions, messier emotions, because they are our family, they are our mothers, and maybe with our fathers too, in a way. I think with my dad I was slightly less close than with my mum, so the messiness of all my emotions sort of came out with my mum. So I guess that's what I was doing with the relationship with Hara and Irini.
Yeah, honestly, really, really beautiful. But I'm really interested in your research process for this book. So obviously, because it tackles a lot of themes like human greed, but also climate change and family and dynamics. But the description of the fire, the description of the place is very, very vivid. So yeah, I just wondered what your research process was like, and also what you uncovered about the effects of climate change that are happening that a lot of people may not know about.
So the first part of my research was to go to various places in Greece, interview people, particularly people who had experienced the fire in Madi, and also the massive, massive fire in Evia, which destroyed so much of the forest. I did quite a lot of research in Madi. I spoke to a lot of people. I heard their stories. I was taken around the area. But I had a lot of people describing to me the before and after, because I hadn't visited Madi before the fire. So I had people saying this, if you look up that hill, you couldn't see those houses. That's a very simple statement. If you looked up the hill, you couldn't see those houses. But what was there instead? That means something big was lost. And what, it was the forest. Suddenly, the of those houses had survived, but the forest that stood between this one house and the other had cleared. So there was this sort of open land. And I had to sort of really kind of stand there and imagine, well, what did this place look like before the fire? And that was a huge lesson for me. Like, I think if I wasn't doing my research and I had just visited the place and somebody had said yes, and I knew about the fire, I don't think I would have spent so long just staring at things and wondering, and really kind of trying to focus on what might have been there before and what does it feel like for people who live there, whose entire landscape has changed. So there was that element, just the sheer simplicity of walking around and having someone explain things. The other thing was hearing the stories. The other thing was hearing an element of, and I think this is very common when you have suffered severe trauma, is to want to blame something tangible. And often there are tangible things to blame. And believe me, there were. The government and the funding of the government, the funding, the way that it funded the fire brigade, the police, there were very legitimate problems. But what I realized is that people wanted to kind of clasp these very legitimate problems, hold on to them so tightly. This is what's to blame. This is who has done this to us. And therefore, in those times of trauma, and I would put myself in this situation, I imagine I would feel the same, it's so difficult to take a step back. How can you? And say, is there something bigger? And if we allow that something bigger to continue, we are going to be in this situation time and time again, desperately blaming the police or the fire brigade or whatever. Doesn't mean that they shouldn't be blamed. And so it was that combination of hearing the stories, hearing people's reactions, seeing for myself, trying to understand what was lost by looking at the difference between what was described to me and what I was seeing in front of me. So it was a very real, this is what I meant when in lockdown I couldn't do these things. It was a very real experience in the sense that I was trying very hard while I was there to really take on board what had been lost, and then really hearing people's stories, sitting with them, seeing their scars. Someone said to me, I was in the cafe that had become a hub, and someone said to me, this is the only place in the world where you don't have to ask anyone how they got burnt, because everybody knows. Because it wasn't just one house. And, there were people that just had these sort of burn marks going up their arms or up along their face. And it was a reminder And then there were other people who couldn't speak. I tried to speak to this man and his eyes just filled with tears, and that was it. He couldn't speak. But that said a lot. There was that part of my research, and that was very sad. I found it disorientating, kind of haunting when I left. And I felt really guilty because I felt relieved when I left. Then the other part of my research, it was to talk to scientists. So it's all in the back of the book, the people that I interviewed. The person I would mention the most now is Peter Stott, who works with the Met Office. Professor Peter Stott, he also teaches at which university? Oh God, it's dropped out of my head. He's an academic as well, and it's just dropped out of my head, sorry. But I interviewed him. He was absolutely fascinating to speak to. I interviewed his wife as well. They founded something called Climate Stories, which is, if you go online and type in Climate Stories, it's a place where people can write about in fiction or make films, or, it's sort of a creative hub for writing about climate change. And so I interviewed him, and I interviewed another one of his colleagues because I wanted to find out as much as I possibly could about the fires, about our contribution, about what that meant, about the Mediterranean region, about other regions. So there was a lot of research that I did in that area, which fed the story that I was writing.
Yeah, so definitely this kind of mix between like personal stories, but also like, I guess, like the science or the geography or the geology as well, I guess, behind it all. And I mean, we did talk a bit about this last time you were on the show, and you have now another book that you have done extensive research for, where you have engaged and interacted with people. And it's still something that I'm really interested in understanding a bit better. How do you deal with all the stories that you hear? Because when you're on your phone and you're scrolling on social media, and I guess also maybe when you're researching during lockdown, or when you're doing things remotely, I guess being able to switch off or scroll past or whatever is a form of being able to switch off. But I know when you're in the field, there's no real switch off time, and I guess it's only when you're back home, and that is very difficult. So I'm really interested to hear from you about how you process and how you deal with that sort of stuff.
So I do have therapy, which helps, but writing, that is the way, because I know I'm doing it for a purpose. Well, not always, like volunteer work, it's not always that way. But when I do know there's a purpose, I know that I can find my feet when I'm writing. So it gives me a sense of security. So I guess that's the thing. And plus the therapy, which is very helpful.
Yeah. One of the things I really appreciate about your writing and I guess your style is the way that you preserve dignity in all of the stories that you tell. You talk about some really traumatic and very kind of like gory things that happen, but your description of them is very gentle. Kind of a lot of things will happen off the page that we can kind of fill in the gaps if we want to, but we also don't have to if we don't want to. And there's details that you just don't go into, and I really appreciate that, like as a reader, but also like as a person, because I feel like if I was to speak to you as a person, I feel like whatever I tell you, you would deal with it with sensitivity, and that's such a nice thing to know, that the author is nice, like because we don't know the person behind the words, right? So that I find a lot of comfort in that.
Oh, thank you.
But I can imagine.
Yeah, thank you.
But I can imagine though, because you are fundamentally, especially when you go out to do research, doing it in order to write a book, which is something commercial, which is something that's going to earn you money. It's your job. Do you feel that conflict?
Yes.
And how do you manage that?
That's what I have to deal with in my therapy. That's the thing that's really difficult. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it is the stories I've heard, but sometimes it's the combination of the stories I've heard and what I'm doing with it. But then it's, in my head, it's become a bit like, well, a heart surgeon makes money, does a job that goes into your heart in a way, but it's their job, and and there's that guilt that I have, but I think I have to survive myself, and in a way this is my job, and I have to always keep my feet on the ground and remember why I'm doing it. That's the thing. And remember that the person that's on, in a way, in inverted commas, the operating table, is a human being that has a family, and the reason you're doing it is because you believe, you want to help, you want to, it's all about motivation. And I guess I approach these stories, the reason I approach them in the first place, and this is what I always have to remember, is there's something that's breaking my heart. There's something I've seen that's scaring me. There's something I've seen that reminds me of my family in some way or another, maybe in ways that I don't even know at that time. So it comes from a really deep place, and I want to write because I want to figure something out. I want to shout, but I can't shout, so I want to say something through words, and I'm hoping and wishing that people will hear. So it comes from there. And I think maybe that's where you're getting that from. What you've said, that lovely thing you said about me, I think what you're picking up on is that when I approach a subject to research, I've already approached it from the position that something's broken my heart. So if something has already broken my heart, of course I'm going to approach the subject with sensitivity, because I remember those people are human. That's why it's broken my heart. Or I remember this animal has feelings, and this animal has a right to be on this earth as much as we do, and that has what's broken my heart. Do you see? So I approach it with that, and what I'm doing after that is my job. In a sense, it's my job, but I want to try and do it as best I can. And how do I do it as best I can? I try and write it in a way where it's going to reach people and touch people, and probably, hopefully, help them to feel what I felt at the beginning, if you see what I mean. So I think that's what it is.
Yeah.
I try, and I have these conflicts, and I have to speak to myself and remember what my feelings are.
Yeah, and I think it's worth mentioning as well, last time on the show we talked about the decisions you've made with your choice about what sort of scenes to include or not, but also kind of more broadly about which publishers you want to work with that respect those choices. Like, that's big, right? Like, you don't want to work with publishers, even if they're going to pay you more money, if they want you to do something that will remove the dignity or portray something in a way. Yeah.
Absolutely not. No, never. Yeah.
Okay, so I will end with a final question, although I could carry on speaking to you all day. But I will end with a final question. What do you really hope people will take away from this book?
God, that's a tough question, because I know it, but I can't vocalize it for some reason. I guess it's the accumulation of everything we've spoken about. It's that I hope they feel something that I felt, which drew me to go and speak to people. But I hope it gets people thinking about blame attribution, about family, about our environment, about when something is lost, what do we do with that? I just hope it gets people thinking and feeling. And I guess that's all I ever hope for with the books that I write, that it will help get people thinking and feeling about the subject matter and feeling. I think for me, the important thing is the feeling.
And I'm sure anyone who picks up the book will definitely feel something and explore. I too hope that they explore really how they're feeling, because it's confronting. It's very confronting to be faced with such strong emotion and kind of power in a story that is happening around us every day. Like, these things are happening every day, and how long can we turn a blind eye for?
And that's, I didn't want this to be an apocalyptic novel of the future. I wanted it to be almost a picture, as much of a picture as I could paint, in a way, with writing, of what is happening now.
Yeah. And as always with your books as well, there is hope there's that sense of that not all is lost, and that it's not too late. There are things that we can do, and there's the ways that we can come together. You write a lot about community and family and friendship as well.
Absolutely, yes. And I think this is a thread through all my stories, that hope exists in love. As corny as that sounds, because that's always what I saw, even when I was working in the refugee camps. Hope existed with family, with connections, with friendships, with love. And that, I think, that's the message in this book as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you know what, Christy, thank you so much. It has been so wonderful speaking to you. And the Book of Fire is out on the 17th of August. So I hope people run and get hold of it and read it and absolutely love it as well. Thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, thank you, Samia. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for Christy for her time today. As always, this was such an incredible, warm and interesting conversation. I loved every moment of it, and I hope that everyone listening does too. If you enjoyed the podcast, please follow The Diverse Bookshelf on your podcast platform of choice and connect with me on social media. I would really appreciate it if you could rate and leave a review, as it helps more people find the show.